Vanessa stepped out of the restaurant into the cool evening air, her high heels clicking against the pavement. She had just finished a dinner meeting, and the night was still young. As she walked toward her car, she felt confident and at ease, her mind focused on the business deals she had just discussed. She had always loved this part of town, the hustle and bustle of the city mixing with the elegance of the luxury shops. Everything was just as it should be, until it wasn't. She noticed a police officer standing near the entrance of the restaurant, looking at her with an odd expression. At first, she thought nothing of it. After all, she was a successful black woman in a city where people were often quick to make assumptions. But then the officer moved toward her, blocking her path. His posture was tense, his gaze intense, as if he was already accusing her of something. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice sharp. "You can't be here." Vanessa paused, taken aback by the officer's sudden approach. "I'm just walking to my car," she replied, trying to keep her voice calm. She had been through enough situations like this to know that remaining composed was the best way to handle it. The officer's response wasn't what she expected. "I said you can't be here," he repeated, now stepping closer. His tone was hostile, his eyes narrowing. Vanessa frowned, beginning to feel the tension rising. "I don't understand. I'm just heading to my car. Is there a problem?" She tried to keep her voice steady, but something in the officer's stance made her uncomfortable. The officer looked her up and down, scanning her clothing, her designer dress, her perfectly polished shoes. He seemed to judge her in that instant, his eyes flicking back to her face with suspicion. "I'm going to need to see your ID," he demanded, his voice rising a little. Vanessa was taken aback. She had been stopped by officers before. People had mistaken her for someone else, questioned her, even scrutinized her simply because she was black. But this officer's behavior felt different. There was a hostility in his eyes that she hadn't experienced before. And as she stood there, confused and frustrated, the crowd of people around her began to gather, sensing the tension in the air. Some stared, some pretended not to notice, and others began to take out their phones, recording the exchange. "I don't see why I should have to show you my ID," Vanessa said, her voice remaining calm but firm. "I've done nothing wrong." The officer stepped even closer, invading her space. "I said, show me your ID now," he barked, his hand hovering near his belt, where his radio was clipped. Vanessa felt her heart race. She wasn't sure what was happening here, but she knew she wasn't going to let him bully her into submission. She was a successful CEO, a powerful woman, and no one had the right to treat her this way, especially not because of her skin color. She wasn't going to be intimidated. "I've already told you, I'm just walking to my car," she said again, her voice shaking slightly, but with a new edge of defiance. But the officer wasn't listening. In an instant, he took a step forward, forcefully pushing her back with his chest. The action was so sudden, so unexpected, that Vanessa stumbled back, nearly falling to the ground. A sharp pain shot up her spine as she caught herself. She couldn't believe what was happening. It was like everything had shifted in that moment. The crowd was in shock. Some gasped, some muttered under their breath, and others shouted for the officer to stop. But no one stepped in, no one took action. Everyone seemed too afraid to get involved, unsure of how to handle the situation. Vanessa stood frozen for a moment, the pain from the shove pulsing through her body. "Show." He looked up at the officer, disbelief written across her face. "You have no right to do that," she said, her voice now full of anger and frustration. "This is assault. You can't just push people around like that." The officer didn't seem to care. Instead, he raised his voice even louder, commanding her to move along. "Move along now, or I'll arrest you for disturbing the peace." Vanessa's hands balled into fists, her nails digging into her palms. She took a deep breath, trying to remain calm, but the injustice of it all threatened to overwhelm her. She wasn't going to let this officer get away with treating her like this. Not now. Not ever. As she steadied herself, The crowd began to murmur again, their phones still recording. Vanessa looked around, noticing the glances from people nearby. Some seemed to recognize her, whispering to each other in disbelief, but no one came forward. No one stepped in to defend her. And then, just as quickly as the tension had escalated, the officer took a step back. He seemed to realize something. Maybe it was the stares of the people around him, or maybe it was the sense that things were getting out of hand. But before Vanessa could say another word, he turned and walked away without another word. For a long moment she just stood there, feeling a mix of emotions, anger, confusion, and disbelief. How had things gotten so out of hand so quickly? What had she done to deserve that kind of treatment? She didn't know it yet, but someone important had been watching from a distance, seeing everything that had just unfolded. This person, who knew who Vanessa truly was, would soon take action, and everything would change. The officer had no idea who he had just crossed, but Vanessa did, and the story was far from over. As Vanessa stood there, still recovering from the shock of the officer's sudden aggression, her mind raced. She could feel the stares of the people around her, some in awe, some in confusion. A few were even whispering to one another, realizing who she was. She could see the glint of camera, aerophones being held up, recording the scene. The crowd was not necessarily hostile, but there was a sense of helplessness, as if they didn't know how to respond. Everyone was frozen in place, unsure of what to do next. Her heart was pounding in her chest. She had been in uncomfortable situations before, but nothing quite like this. The sheer audacity of the officer's behavior had caught her off guard. Vanessa had faced prejudice and discrimination throughout her life, but this felt different. It felt like an attack on her dignity, her worth, and her position in society. The officer's action wasn't just a mistake, it was intentional. He had looked at her, judged her, and chosen to act out his racism in a way that could not be ignored. "Are you all right?" someone asked from the crowd. Vanessa didn't recognize the voice, but she turned her head to see a middle-aged man staring at her with concern. He was standing a few feet away, watching her carefully. He had been one of the people recording the incident on his phone, but he seemed genuinely worried about her. Vanessa took a deep breath, forcing herself to calm down. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice steady, though the tension in her body still lingered. "Thank you for asking." But she knew she wasn't fine. Not really. The moment had shaken her deeply. It wasn't just the physical shove, though that had hurt. It was the fact that it had been done with such disregard, such confidence, as if the officer knew he could get away with it. She had money, she had power, she had influence. But in that moment, none of that mattered. To him, she was just another black woman on the street, someone to be pushed aside, belittled, and ignored. She took a few more steps back, feeling the eyes of the crowd on her. Her mind flashed to her company, to the employees she had worked so hard to support, to the initiatives she had spent years building. How could she let this go? How could she, of all people, allow something like this to happen without speaking out? But as much as she wanted to act, something held her back. The officer had already walked away, seemingly unaware of the impact of his actions. She could feel the heat rise in her chest as she thought about it. What if this was just the beginning? What if this officer had treated others like this before and gotten away with it? What if someone else was next? Vanessa's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a car door opening. She turned to see a sleek black car pull up to the curb in front of her. It wasn't just any car. It was a luxury vehicle, a car that only someone in her financial circle would own. She didn't recognize the driver at first, but as the man stepped out of the car, Vanessa's heart skipped a beat. It was James Anderson, the billionaire philanthropist and a longtime friend of hers. He was someone she trusted, someone who had supported her business ventures from the start. "Vanessa," he said, his voice full of concern as he approached her. "I saw everything. Are you okay?" James had always been protective of her, but this was different. His face was tight with anger, his usually calm demeanor shattered by the injustice he had just witnessed. He had been watching from across the street when the officer had pushed her, and as much as he hated to admit it, the sight had stirred something deep inside of him, a sense of helplessness he hadn't felt in years. "I'm fine," Vanessa repeated, though the words felt hollow now. She knew James could see through her. "No, you're not," James said softly, shaking his head. He stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "I can't believe he did that. I'm going to make sure this officer pays for what he did." Vanessa paused, her mind flashing back to the moment when she had almost fallen. She had been in shock, unable to react. But now, with James by her side, the anger was bubbling up inside of his. Chapeau. She had always been the strong one, the one who stayed calm and collected in difficult situations. But this was different. The feeling of being small, of being helpless in the face of such raw hatred, was overwhelming. "I don't know if it's worth it," Vanessa admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if no one believes me? What if they just brush it off as another story of a woman being too sensitive?" James's expression softened, and he placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Vanessa, you've been through so much already. You're not just anyone. People will listen to you. We can't let this go. We have to show them that this isn't okay, no matter who you are." His words hit home. Vanessa had spent her life fighting for equality, for respect, for justice. She had created programs that empowered marginalized communities, had built a business empire that was a testament to what hard work and determination could accomplish. But now, for the first time in her life, she felt as though the system had failed her. It wasn't just the officer, it was everything that had led to this moment. The racial profiling, the stereotyping, the undercurrent of bias that was always lurking beneath the surface. "I won't let him get away with this," Vanessa said, her voice stronger now, "but I'm going to need your help." James nodded, a small but determined smile crossing his face. "You've got it. We'll make sure this officer faces the consequences." As Vanessa stood there, feeling the weight of the situation settle in, she realized something. This wasn't just about her. It wasn't just about a random incident on a street corner. This was about something much bigger. This was about the systemic racism that so many people faced every single day in ways both large and small, and if she had the power to do something about it, she couldn't remain silent. The first step, she knew, was to get the footage of the incident into the right hands. The video had already gone viral, and the next few hours would determine how far this story would go. But one thing was clear. Vanessa was no longer just a victim of an unfortunate encounter. She was a force to be reckoned with, and the world was about to find out just how powerful she could be. As Vanessa sat in the back of the sleek black car, the reality of the situation started to settle in. She glanced at her reflection in the tinted windows, trying to focus on her face, but it was hard. The officer's actions had shaken her in ways she couldn't yet put into words. Her mind was still racing, but she knew that this wasn't just another moment of injustice to brush off. This was her moment to act. James had been quiet since they left the scene, but Vanessa knew he wasn't just brooding. He was calculating. She could feel the energy in the car shift, a shared determination between them. James had been a constant figure in her life, someone who had supported her through the most challenging phases of her career. He wasn't just a philanthropist, he was a true friend who understood what it meant to fight for change. And now, he was right beside her, ready to support her through whatever came next. "Vanessa, you know we can't let this go," James finally spoke, his tone firm but gentle. "You've built a reputation, not just as a businesswoman, but as someone who stands for what's right. This can't slide under the radar." Vanessa exhaled deeply, her mind filled with the weight of his words. She knew he was right. Her position, her power, her influence, all of it had brought her here, to this point, where one moment of violence could shift the course of so many lives. But it wasn't just about her. This incident was symbolic of something much larger, something systemic. She had the power to make it known, to speak up for the countless others who had been silenced by fear or indifference. Her phone buzzed, breaking her reverie. It was her assistant, Samira. "Vanessa," Sam Taz. Ira's voice crackled through the line. "The video is all over social media. It's trending and people are calling for justice. A lot of people have recognized you. They're asking if you're going to speak out about it." Vanessa clenched her jaw. She hadn't yet decided how public she wanted to go with this. She had built her business on the principles of equality and fairness, but public confrontations were a different arena. They were messy, unpredictable. But as the words from her earlier conversation with James echoed in her mind, Vanessa knew what needed to be done. "I'll be making a statement soon," Vanessa said, her voice steady but with a hint of resolve. "Set up a press conference for tomorrow morning. Let's make sure everything is ready. And Samira, find out everything you can about the officer. I want to know who he is, where he's from, and who his superiors are." Samira paused on the other end of the line. "I'll get to it right away." Vanessa ended the call, her thoughts racing. The officer's face was burned into her memory. He had been so quick to dismiss her, so confident in his power to control the situation. She would make sure he faced the consequences of his actions. But first, she needed to prepare. "James," Vanessa began, turning to face him, "I think it's time we take action. I want to make sure this officer doesn't get away with it. But I also want to do more than that. This isn't just about me. It's about every person who's been mistreated, ignored, and pushed aside because of the color of their skin." James nodded in agreement. "Absolutely. But we can't do this alone. This needs to be bigger than just one incident. We need to create a movement, a real change. We need to show people that there's power in standing up, no matter how big or small the injustice." Vanessa leaned back in her seat, her gaze focused on the dark streets outside the wall. Indau. The city was alive, bustling with activity, but she felt strangely detached from it all. This was no longer just about her daily life or her work. It was about using her platform to raise her voice for something greater. She thought back to the conversation she had had with her lawyer earlier. The legal team was already on top of it, gathering evidence and preparing for the inevitable backlash. But it wasn't just about taking legal action, it was about creating a narrative that would reach the masses. The officer's actions had been captured on video, but it was her story that would elevate it to a larger cause. The car pulled up to Vanessa's penthouse building, and she stepped out, her heels clicking against the marble floor. James followed her inside, and they made their way to the private elevator. The moment the doors closed, Vanessa let out a long breath, preparing herself for what was to come. "Let's get to work," Vanessa said, her voice full of purpose. By the time she reached her office, Vanessa had already made the decision to go public with the story. The press conference would be tomorrow, and she would use the platform to do more than just speak out about the incident. She would use it to open a dialogue, to demand changes in the system. She would not just be the face of a viral moment, she would be the face of the movement that would follow. Her team had already begun setting up the press conference, the room lined with cameras, reporters, and people eager to hear her side of the story. Vanessa stood in front of the mirrors, adjusting her jacket. She looked at herself one last time before walking out. She wasn't just a CEO or a businesswoman at that moment. She was a leader, ready to lead the charge for change. As she walked into the conference room, the bright lights of the cameras flashed in her face. But she didn't flinch. She was calm, collected, her voice steady. The crowd quieted as she began to speak, her words powerful and measured. "This isn't just about me," she started, her voice hitting through the silence. "It's about every black person who has been harassed, assaulted, and dismissed. It's about every person who has faced the harsh reality of systemic racism. This incident is one of many, and it's time to hold those in power accountable. The room was silent as she spoke, her words resonating with the audience. She could feel the weight of the moment, knowing that her words were just the beginning of a long journey. But she was ready. The world had just seen the beginning of something powerful, and Vanessa was determined to be the one to lead it. As she finished her speech, the applause was overwhelming, and Vanessa knew that this was only the start. The journey ahead would be difficult, but she had made the first step. Now the world was watching, and she was ready to fight. As the days passed after the press conference, Vanessa's life seemed to shift into a different gear. The video of the incident had gone viral, spreading across news outlets, social media platforms, and blogs faster than she could have imagined. What had started as a shocking and painful personal experience was now a global conversation about police brutality, racial profiling, and the systemic injustices faced by people of color. Vanessa had never been one for seeking the spotlight. She had spent years quietly building her company, focusing on her business and the initiatives she believed in. But now, with the world watching, she knew she couldn't retreat into the shadows. She had to be the voice for those who had been silenced by the system. She sat in her office, staring at the flood of emails, messages, and notifications that had flooded her inbox in the last few days. Many of them were from strangers, offering support and expressing gratitude for her bravery in speaking out. Others were from high-profile figures, activists, politicians, celebrities, all asking how I could help. But there was one email in particular that caught her attention. It was from a person she hadn't expected to hear from. Subject: "We need to talk. James Anderson." Vanessa clicked open the email, which contained only a few lines of text. "Vanessa, I've been in touch with some people who can help push this to the next level. We have an opportunity to make a real impact. Together. Call me when you can. James." Her heart skipped a beat. James Anderson, the billionaire philanthropist, had always been an ally in her fight for social justice. But this felt different. This wasn't just about one incident. This was about turning the anger and frustration into real, systemic change. Vanessa picked up the phone immediately and dialed his number. When he answered, she could hear the urgency in his voice. "We have a shot at something big, Vanessa. The momentum is building, and people are listening. I've been in contact with several organizations and groups who want to work with you. We can start a fund for police reform, we can create educational programs, we can push for policy change, but we need to act fast." Vanessa's mind raced. This was bigger than she had ever imagined. This wasn't just about seeking justice for herself anymore. This was about using her platform to create real, lasting change. And it wasn't going to be easy. The backlash from powerful institutions could be intense, and the fight would be long. But Vanessa was done being quiet. She was done being passive. "I'm in," she said firmly, her voice full of resolve. "What do we need to do?" James outlined a plan. They would use her company's extensive network and resources to start a campaign focused on police accountability and racial justice. They would work with advocacy groups, law firms, and grassroots organizations to create a comprehensive initiative that would push for real change in the system. As James spoke, Vanessa felt a sense of purpose fill her. She had always known that her platform could be used for good, but now it was clear. This was the moment she had been waiting for. She wasn't just going to be a symbol of success anymore, she was going to be a force for change. The next few days were a blur. Vanessa met with her legal team, her marketing experts, and her core leadership team to map out the details of the campaign. They launched a public initiative that included raising funds for police reform, providing resources for communities impacted by police violence, and creating a network of organizations dedicated to holding law enforcement accountable. But it wasn't just about raising money. It was about telling a story that needed to be heard. And Vanessa knew that the most powerful way to share that story was by connecting with the public on a personal level. She began working with social media influencers, activists, and journalists to amplify the message, reaching millions of people who were tired of hearing empty promises. Her company became a symbol of activism, and Vanessa herself became the face of the movement. But the more she stepped into the public eye, the more she realized the pressure that came with it. She couldn't escape the constant scrutiny. Every decision she made was under the microscope. Every word she spoke was analyzed, dissected, and sometimes twisted. The attacks came quickly. Some people praised her bravery, while others accused her of being too outspoken, too quick to jump on the bandwagon. She was accused of using the incident to boost her company's image, of making a spectacle of her own victimization. Vanessa knew that the attacks would come. They always did when people of power began to challenge the status quo, but she refused to be silenced. One evening, as she sat in her office, looking over the latest batch of hateful comments, her assistant Samira walked in. "Vanessa, you've got to see this," Samira said, holding up her phone. "It's all over the news." Vanessa tooled. "Okay," the phone, her eyes scanning the headlines on the screen. The officer involved in the incident had been suspended, pending an internal investigation. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Vanessa felt a rush of relief. The first step in holding him accountable had been taken. "Good," she said, setting the phone down. "But it's not enough. This is just the beginning." James called her later that evening, his voice filled with excitement. "Vanessa, we've made waves. The media is covering the movement, and now there are people in Congress pushing for real change. We're getting attention, and that's exactly what we need." But despite the wins, Vanessa knew the road ahead would be long and difficult. There were powerful people who would fight tooth and nail to keep the system as it was. The officer might have been suspended, but he wouldn't be the last to use his power for personal gain. And the more she thought about it, the more Vanessa realized this campaign needed to be sustainable. They needed to create a lasting foundation, not just for her, but for generations to come. As the weeks passed, Vanessa traveled across the country, speaking at rallies, meeting with victims of police violence, and listening to their stories. She visited communities that had been ravaged by inequality, where the effects of systemic racism were apparent in every aspect of life. And in every conversation, she heard the same thing. People were tired. They were tired of waiting for change, tired of hoping that things would get better on their own. But Vanessa was starting to believe that change was possible. They could make the world listen. Together, they could push for a future where incidents like hers would no longer be seen as the norm. They could be the generation to break the cycle. And as Vanessa stood before a crowd in a city hall meeting, speaking about police accountability and justice reform, she knew that the moment had arrived. This wasn't just a campaign anymore, it was a movement, and he was ready to lead it. Vanessa had always been someone who thrived on control. She had built her empire from the ground up, and every step she took in her career had been carefully calculated. But nothing could have prepared her for the whirlwind that followed her public stand against the police officer. The movement had grown exponentially, and with it came new challenges. The pressure was mounting, and while her resolve to see justice done never wavered, the toll it was taking on her personal life was becoming undeniable. Her office, once a sanctuary of calm where she could focus on her company's growth, had now become a battleground for social change. Staff were constantly in and out, strategizing with various activists, journalists, and even political figures who had reached out, eager to be part of the campaign. Every phone call seemed urgent, every email critical, and Vanessa was at the center of it all. But with each victory came new obstacles. The officer who had shoved her was under investigation, but his supporters were just as vocal as the people demanding his dismissal. The public was divided, and every time Vanessa spoke out, the pressure to say the right thing felt heavier. The online hate had been relentless, with countless messages calling her a divisive figure, playing the race card, or using the incident to profit. For a moment, Vanessa doubted herself. Was she doing the right thing? Was she really making a difference, or just fueling the fire of polarization? She tried to push those doubts aside, focusing on the work. There were still things to be done. She had a purpose, a bigger mission than herself, but the weight of it all was starting to crack the facade of calm confidence she had carefully crafted for years. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Vanessa returned to her penthouse, exhausted. The city lights outside were a blur of motion, and as she sank into her chair, she took a deep breath, trying to unwind. Her phone buzzed with another notification, but this time it wasn't from her team or a supporter. It was from an unfamiliar number. "Vanessa, this is Detective Markison. I need to talk to you about the incident. It's urgent." Her heart skipped a beat. The message was brief, but there was something about the tone that made her uneasy. Why was a detective contacting her now, so late at night? She stared at the screen, her mind racing. Had something new come to light about the officer, or was there something more behind the scenes? Without hesitation, Vanessa called back. "Detective Markison," she said, once he picked up. "What's going on?" "Miss Collins." The voice on the other end was steady, but filled with concern. "I've been investigating the officer who assaulted you, and I've uncovered something you need to know. It's bigger than just him." Vanessa sat up straight, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten. "What are you talking about?" The detective paused, and when he spoke again, his voice dropped lower, as if to ensure no one else could hear. "I've traced connections between Officer Williams and several influential figures in the city's law enforcement and political networks. It's clear this wasn't just a random incident. He's been shielded by powerful people for a long time, and now that you've gone public, they're scrambling to protect him. I need your help." Vanessa's breath caught in her throat. She had known, deep down, that this was never just about one officer's actions. The system, the entire infrastructure around it, was rotten. It wasn't just the officer who had pushed her that night. It was the people behind him, the ones who allowed him to act with impunity. "Tell me what you need me to do," Vanessa said, her voice hardening with resolve. "I'll do whatever it takes to expose this." "I can't do it alone," Detective Markison replied. "We need to gather more evidence, more than just a few leaked files. We need someone with influence, someone the Bach did. You can't ignore. That's where you come in." Vanessa was silent for a moment, her mind racing. She had a choice now. She could continue the campaign for justice in her own way, gathering public support, making noise on social media, and pushing for systemic change through legal channels. Or she could take the riskier path, diving into the shadows of law enforcement corruption, a world far more dangerous and complicated than she had ever imagined. But she knew the answer almost immediately. "I'm in," Vanessa said, her voice steady with determination. "What do we need to do?" The next few days were a blur of covert meetings, encrypted messages, and late-night phone calls. Vanessa was now a part of something much bigger than her original campaign. She was no longer just fighting for the people who had suffered at the hands of corrupt officers. She was now taking on the entire system that had allowed it to happen. James Anderson, her longtime friend and ally, was brought into the fold, and together they navigated a web of politicians, law enforcement officials, and shadowy figures who had their own vested interests in maintaining the status quo. Vanessa had known that money and power could protect people, but now she was seeing firsthand how deep those protections went. There were powerful people behind the scenes who would stop at nothing to keep the truth from being exposed. But with every step forward came more resistance. Her every move was scrutinized by those who wanted to discredit her. False rumors spread that she was using the movement to line her pockets, that her intentions were only to gain sympathy and push her business agenda. It was becoming harder to ignore the attacks, but Vanessa knew one thing: she couldn't back down. It was during one of the clandestine meetings with Detective Markison that they received a breakthrough. A source within the DPO department had leaked critical documents, communications between Officer Williams and several high-ranking officials. The documents were explosive. They showed clear evidence of a network of officers who had been covering for each other, exchanging favors and silencing victims to protect their own. The pieces were finally falling into place. With the documents in hand and the growing support from the public, Vanessa and her team knew they had the leverage to make a real change. But it wasn't going to be easy. The stakes had never been higher, and as they moved forward with their plan to expose the corruption, Vanessa realized just how much was riding on her shoulders. She had started this journey wanting to hold one officer accountable, but now she was on the front lines of a battle for justice that would affect the future of law enforcement, politics, and society itself. The road ahead would be fraught with danger, but Vanessa was more determined than ever. She had made her choice, and she would see it through, no matter what it took. As the days passed, the pressure on Vanessa only grew. The movement she had started, once a small ripple, was now a full-blown wave crashing through the barriers of the justice system. The leaked documents had stirred the pot, exposing a network of corrupt officers, politicians, and law enforcement officials who had worked together to protect each other for years. But with the truth now in the open, the stakes had never been higher. There were those who would do anything to silence her, to keep the system intact. Vanessa stood at the window of her penthouse, looking out over the city she had known so well. But tonight, everything felt different. The city lights twinkled like stars in a sky that had never been so dark. She had never been more aware of the weight of her choices. The noise in her head was constant now, the phone calls, the meetings, the endless cycle of media appearances. Yet, beneath it all, there was something else growing inside her, a quiet determination, a belief that what she was doing mattered more than anything she had done before. "Vanessa, you've got a visitor," Samira's voice crackled through the intercom, snapping her out of her thoughts. "Who is it?" Vanessa asked, her eyes still locked on the city below. She didn't expect anyone. The days had been full of work, strategizing and tightening security as more threats poured in. "He says it's urgent. He won't give his name, but he's adamant he needs to speak with you." Vanessa felt a chill run through her. The timing of this felt too suspicious, but something in Samira's voice told her this wasn't just another attempt to unsettle her. It felt important. "Send him up," she replied, turning from the window and taking a seat at her desk. She needed to be ready for whatever came next. Her legal team was pushing forward with a lawsuit, and she was preparing for the next phase of public engagement, but she knew she had to remain vigilant. The door opened quietly a few minutes later, and in walked a man she had never seen before. His dark hair was neatly combed, and he wore a long overcoat, his eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses. Vanessa's first instinct was to be cautious. She had become all too familiar with the shadows in the political and law enforcement world. This man could be anyone, an ally, a foe, or something in between. "Miss Collins," he said with a calm voice, closing the door behind him, "I believe we have a lot to discuss." Vanessa studied him for a moment. "I'm listening," she said, her voice steady. She wasn't one for small talk, especially not when the stakes were this high. The man took a seat across from her, not waiting for her to invite him to. He placed a folder on the desk, then slid it toward her. "I have information that could help your case," he said, his tone cool and measured. "But more importantly, it could help you understand the full scope of what's at play here." Vanessa raised an eyebrow. Her curiosity piqued. She had spent months pulling together pieces of the puzzle, but this was new. There had been whispers of people watching from the shadows, influential figures who controlled more than just the local police force. She had always known that exposing the officer who had attacked her would only be the tip of the iceberg. She opened the folder slowly, the pages inside filled with photos, documents, and surveillance reports. Her eyes skimmed over them quickly, piecing together the timeline. "This goes beyond just the officer, doesn't it?" Vanessa said, her voice quiet but filled with clarity. The man nodded slowly. "Much further. Officer Williams was just one pawn in a much larger game. These people, politicians, businessmen, law enforcement, they've been playing a dangerous game of corruption for years. What happened to you wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern." Vanessa felt a cold rush of realization flood her. She had suspected this, but to see it laid out in front of her like this, it was almost overwhelming. The network she was up against wasn't just about a few bad apples. It was a system, a web of connections that reached all the way to the top. And the more she uncovered, the more she realized how deep the corruption ran. The man spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been gathering intel on this group for years. They've done more than just shield officers like Williams. They've been covering up criminal activity, bribing officials, and silencing anyone who dares to speak out. I'm here because I want to help you expose them, but I need your trust." Vanessa took a deep breath. Trust had become a scarce resource. Her entire life had been a series of carefully crafted alliances, but in the world she was now navigating, trust was a dangerous commodity. However, as she looked at the documents in front of her, the truth was undeniable. The man wasn't just offering information, he was offering her too. He keys to unraveling a massive, deeply entrenched system of corruption. "What do you want in return?" Vanessa asked, her voice sharp but controlled. The man leaned forward slightly. "Not much. Just your commitment. The information I'm giving you, it's going to take everything you have to bring it to light. It's not just about fighting this one officer anymore. If you expose what's in those documents, you'll be up against people who will stop at nothing to protect their secrets." Vanessa's mind raced as she processed the weight of his words. She had already taken on an enemy more powerful than she had ever imagined. But now, the stakes were higher than ever. This was no longer just a fight for justice. It was a battle for the very soul of the system itself. She met the man's eyes, and in that moment, something inside her shifted. This wasn't just a fight for one person, or even for a group of people. It was a fight for everyone who had been silenced, oppressed, and forgotten. It was bigger than her company, and even bigger than the movement she had started. It was about standing up to the forces that had controlled the narrative for far too long. "I'm in," Vanessa said firmly, her decision made. "I'll do whatever it takes to take them down." The man smiled, a flicker of approval in his eyes. "Good. We'll need all the help we can get. But be prepared. This will get ugly. They will come after you, after everyone close to you. But if we succeed, it'll be worth it." As the man stood to leave, Vanessa looked down at the documents in front of her once more. She was no longer just fighting for justice. She was now fighting for the future, for the millions of voices that had been ignored, oppressed, and silenced for far too long. The road ahead would be difficult, but Vanessa was more determined than ever. There was no turning back now. She was about to ignite a battle that would change everything, and nothing would stop her. The weeks following the meeting with the mysterious informant were a blur of tension and planning. Vanessa had known the fight would get messy, but the reality of what she was facing began to sink in as the pieces of the puzzle continued to fall into place. The corruption within the law enforcement system wasn't just a few bad apples. It was a complex, interconnected network of power, greed, and influence that spanned far beyond what she could have ever imagined. The officer who had assaulted her was only the tip of the iceberg. As the pressure mounted, so did the stakes. The movement she had started in the wake of her own assault had grown into something far more powerful, but also far more dangerous. Social media was buzzing with calls for justice, and the world's eyes were firmly fixed on Vanessa. She was no longer just a victim. She was a symbol of resistance, of the fight against a corrupt system. But with that visibility came risks she hadn't anticipated. One evening, as Vanessa sat in her office reviewing the latest batch of evidence, her phone buzzed. It was a message from James Anderson. "Vanessa, we've got a problem. Someone's been leaking information. Be careful." Her heart skipped a beat. She knew what James meant. The last few weeks had seen leaks of confidential documents and plans, information about the corrupt network within the police force and the high-profile figures behind it. Vanessa had trusted her team completely, but now she realized that the enemies she was making were more formidable than she had thought. They had connections everywhere. She immediately picked up the phone and dialed James's number. "What's going on?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "I've been hearing rumors," James replied, his voice tinged with concern. "People in your inner circle are talking. There's talk of bribes, of threats. Someone's trying to shut this down before it goes any further." Vanessa's grip tightened on the phone. She had known this day would come. In every battle for justice, there were those who would go to any length to preserve the status quo. They had the power, the money, and the connections. But they didn't have the truth. And as long as she held the truth in her hands, she couldn't back down. "Don't worry," she said, her voice resolute. "We won't stop. If anything, this makes me more determined. We've got to push forward. I'll take extra precautions." "I'm arranging for some security to help you out," James said. "We don't know who's behind this, but we need to be ready for anything." Vanessa nodded, knowing James was right. As she ended the call, she glanced out the window at the dark city below. The lights seemed dimmer now, almost as if the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. The following days were a whirlwind of activity. Vanessa, along with James and her legal team, continued to press forward with the campaign. They organized rallies, held press conferences, and continued to shine a light on the systemic issues that had plagued the law enforcement system for so long. But now, the stakes felt different. The threats weren't just abstract anymore. They were real. She could feel the weight of it all, the danger that had crept into her life. One morning, as she was leaving her penthouse, her assistant Samira called her into the office. "Vanessa, you need to see this," Samira said urgently. "It's all over the news." Vanessa walked into the office, her stomach tightening. The television was on, showing a news segment about her. The reporter was speaking rapidly, almost breathlessly. Breaking news. Vanessa Collins, the black billionaire CEO leading a movement for justice against police brutality, has found herself at the center of a growing controversy. Sources close to Collins claim that she has been working with law enforcement insiders to expose a widespread network of corruption within the department. But are her efforts really about justice? Or is there something more behind this movement? Vanessa's blood ran cold as the anchor continued. Some critics have alleged that Collins's campaign is not just about fighting for justice, but rather an attempt to leverage public sympathy for personal gain. The billionaire CEO has faced accusations of using her platform to promote her company, making millions in profits off of the movement. Experts suggest that the focus may be shifting from real reform to personal ambition. Vanessa stood frozen in place, staring at the television screen. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. The narrative was shifting. Now, instead of being seen as a champion for justice, she was being painted as a manipulator, someone using the movement for her own benefit. The media was spinning the truth, twisting her intentions and turning the tide of public opinion against her. Samira looked at her, her face pale with concern. "They're trying to discredit you, Vanessa. We need to do something." Vanessa clenched her fists, her mind racing. This was the moment when everything could go wrong. If the media continued to spin this story, if people began to believe that she was just another billionaire using a cause for profit, the entire movement could fall apart. She could lose everything, the support, the momentum, the very fight she had started. No, Vanessa said, her voice steely. This ends now. That evening, Vanessa decided to take matters into her own hands. She couldn't rely on anyone else to correct the narrative. It was time to set the record straight herself. With James and her legal team by her side, they quickly organized an emergency press conference. When she stepped up to the podium, the flashing lights of cameras blinding her, she took a deep breath, focusing on the crowd in front of her. She was about to fight back, not just for her own reputation, but for the truth. "Thank you for being here today," she began, her voice calm but full of authority. "There are many things I could say in response to the false rumors that have been spreading, but the truth is simple. This movement isn't about me. It's never been about me. It's about all of us, every person who has been affected by the broken system we live in. This isn't about personal gain. It's about justice. It's about making sure that what happened to me, and what has happened to countless others, doesn't go unnoticed." Vanessa's gaze swept over the crowd, meeting the eyes of reporters and activists, her words resonating with a growing sense of urgency. "People will try to discredit us, to twist our message and make us doubt ourselves, but we cannot be silenced. We will not stop fighting for justice, and no matter how hard they try to tear us down, we will continue to expose the truth, because the truth is stronger than their lies." As she finished her statement, the applause from the crowd was overwhelming. The reporters were silent for a moment, clearly taken aback by the strength of her words. Vanessa stepped away from the podium, knowing that this fight was far from over. The battle for justice was only just beginning, and she was ready to see it through to the end. The world was watching, and she would not let them down.